Joy in God, knowing Christ and making Him known.
Today, I want to talk about how are we going to disciple the next generation? This is a question that is perplexing many a ministry leader, a pastor, a parent that has a heart, a concern for the next generation of whether that's the younger end of millennials, but especially Gen Z or those who come after. We see our culture and our society, we see the direction that it's taken and a lot of the challenges that many parents face and many ministry leaders face as far as how to bring discipleship and how to bring teaching and truth to this next generation. And we find a gap that exists between the generations and a struggle to be able to hold on to them well. Many parents experience this in their own homes with their kids, and many pastors and leaders experience this in their churches with those who belong to them. And so my hope is to just leave a number of lessons, keys that I believe are critical to being able to not only teach, but also disciple the next generation. The first thing I would say is teach. We have to teach the next generation. And I know that may sound like a simple statement, but it's where I have to start, because when we talk about teaching, what we're saying is we need to make sure that the next generation knows the truth. We cannot take for granted the fact that this generation is bombarded, inundated with so much information coming from social media and from the internet and from online and from school and other contexts, where we'd be hard-pressed to find the truth in those spaces. And so if there's anything that we would be able to offer to this next generation, it's the truth. It's the truth. Many among this next generation are growing up in homes and in contexts where there's all out and all-time illiteracy, biblical illiteracy. And therefore, more than ever, this is a time where we need to make sure that time is given to being able to pass on the truth of the teachings of Scripture to this next generation. Now, this can happen in many forms and in many contexts and ways, but I cannot emphasize this enough, that if we're going to disciple the next generation, we're not going to disciple them with just entertainment and laser tag and pizza and Pepsi and Takis and comedians and just cool tricks and shows. We need to make sure that we are emphasizing and prioritizing truth. More than anything else, truth. And so I say this because I fear that a lot of the teaching, as we would call it, is relegated to places where we would think that's where it's cared about, whether that's the older people or whether that's the adults or whether that's our ministry leaders or whether that's the parents. That's where teaching is had. But for this next generation, I mean, who cares about the truth? We need to give them something else. The problem is what you win people with is what you end up winning them to. And so if we're not winning this next generation with the truth, then what are we winning them with? Because that's what ultimately is going to determine what we win them to. And so number one, I would say, is teach the next generation. If you want to disciple the next generation, make sure you are teaching the next generation the truth of the Scriptures. The second thing I'd add to that would be model. That's right, model. This next generation, more than teaching, in addition to teaching, is modeling. That's what they want to see. They want to be able to see not only a place where they can receive or hear the truth, they also need to have plenty of spaces, in addition to all of that, where they can see the truth modeled by their teachers, their Sunday school teachers, their counselors, their pastors, their parents, their mentors. There's something attractive about truth that's dressed up in a life that seeks to live it. And so modeling is a very important aspect to the discipleship of the next generation. All we have to do is look to Jesus, look no further, but to Christ himself. He was one who had the entirety of his ministry and his time with his disciples not only marked by taking occasion to teach the truth, but he modeled it. He modeled a life of prayer before his Father. He modeled a life of devotion. He modeled bravery. He modeled courage. He modeled what it looked like to be devoted to the mission that his Father called him to. And so, again, I would highly emphasize the importance of modeling the truth that we are teaching to the next generation. A third thing I would add, how are we going to disciple the next generation? Up close. That's my third point. Up close. For this next generation to be reached and properly discipled, we've got to be prepared to be accessible. That's what this generation values more than anything else, is, are you reachable? Are you accessible? Can they reach out and touch you? Is your home available? Is your life accessible? In other words, they don't want to merely, they have plenty of that through podcasts, through YouTube, and so forth. The church and the community of faith has an advantage. Parents have an advantage that no youth pastor or youth worker can ever have. No teacher at a school can ever have. We have the opportunity to be accessible. And I believe we can leverage this access for the sake of the kingdom and for the sake of reaching this next generation for Christ. And so we want to make sure that we're not just simply dropping leaflets, if you will, from the sky. We want to make sure that we're not simply drive-by passing tracts of truth. We want to make sure that as we aim to teach this and disciple this next generation, we're doing so while being up close and personal. This brings a level of vulnerability, no doubt, but with that vulnerability comes trust, and relationship is born from trust. And there's no way that we can have true and authentic discipleship without relationship. And therefore, when we're up close, what we're saying and what we're doing is we're creating the chances of a relationship with this next generation forming, a relationship in which discipleship can happen. The other thing I would say, or to add to how to disciple this next generation, would be integrity. Integrity. If there's anything more than modeling discipleship, it's having moral strength among this next generation. There are just too many hypocrites that they have seen. There are too many people who've said one thing but done another, who preach one message but live a whole nother way. And if there's anything that can gain traction and lead to our success in winning the trust of the next generation and seeing them properly discipled, it's being known for being men and women of integrity. In other words, what you see is what you get, right? It's who I find you to be on Sunday is who you are on Tuesday. Who I find you to be in the morning is who you are in the evening. Now, this is not advocating for perfection, but it is calling for integrity. This is what we need more than ever in our day and age. The other thing I would add to how to disciple the next generation will be patience. Patience. I think sometimes we can be too ambitious and we want to see the kind of change and the kind of transformation all in overnight. But that's unrealistic. That's not what we see with Christ. Christ modeled patience. How he received his disciples when he first selected them and who they ended up becoming in the book of Acts are just two completely different pictures. But that would have never occurred had he not had the patience with his disciples. And so this is important because you need to give this next generation room to be able to fall and to get up and to fall and to get up, to try and to have error, to try and to have error and to try, so that they can begin to eventually gain their own stride. We all were there at one point in time, and there was somebody who was in our life who modeled the kind of patience that we needed for a season to be able to finally find our own footing. And I think we owe that to this next generation. I think there's something intimidating, there's something exasperating and overwhelming when somebody is growing up in a home or a church environment where they feel like they got to get it together immediately and all overnight. And what we're bound to find in environments like that is a generation that just runs away, a generation that retreats, a generation that leaves the church and doesn't come back. And so we want to create spaces where we're clear on what Jesus is calling us to, but at the same time, there's grace, there's patience for growth, there's room for this generation to be able to find their own footing so that they can know for themselves, not just because someone else tells them, but they can know for themselves what exactly it means to be a follower of Christ. The last thing I'd say when it comes to how to disciple the next generation is prayer. Prayer. This could have been the first thing I would have said, but I wanted it to be the last thing because I didn't want us to forget. We need to trust in God. If prayer does anything, it reminds me of where my help comes from, where my answer comes from, where my hope comes from, where my strength comes from. It doesn't come from me, it comes from God. And discipling the next generation can be overwhelming. It can be daunting. I know there are many, a parent, many a ministry leader who just feels like it's beyond me. I don't get them, I don't know them, and I don't know where to begin. And I feel very empty. I feel very helpless. That's where prayer is so important, because we can draw strength, we can receive grace, we can find all of the hope that we need to be able to be the disciple makers we need to be so that we can trust God for their lives. And so if you're somebody who has a heart for the next generation, if you're somebody who is invested in the next generation, whether you're a parent or you're a ministry leader, God bless you. I think this is a great and a worthwhile opportunities. I know there's a lot that's said out there, generally speaking, about the direction of the next generation, but based upon my own experiences, I have seen that there is a generation that is rising up that has a heart for Christ and that has a desire to want to make a change. And the last thing we need to do is to abandon them. And so let me just encourage you, continue to be about making disciples of the next generation, because they need people like you. They need people who are prepared to not only teach, but to model, not only to model, but to be up close and accessible, to lead out with lives of integrity, who have hearts who are marked with patience, who are prepared to be there for the long run and not just simply to want to see a change overnight, and whose lives are marked by prayer. This is what I believe are some of the key ingredients that go into making disciples of our own children, if those are who are represented by the next generation, or our spiritual children who find themselves in our church communities. Maybe there's a thought or an insight I left out that you'd love to add, or perhaps there's a question. I'd love to continue this conversation in the comment section if you're finding this on YouTube. But until next time, God bless you.
Joy in God, knowing Christ and making Him known.